All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You ever wish there was a cheat code for learning, like some magic trick to make sure you actually remember what you study?
You and me both.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Get ready for a surprisingly simple but crazy powerful technique backed by tons of research that can help you learn and remember things way better. Forget cramming.
Exactly.
We're diving deep into the spacing effect.
It's funny. It's like instead of chugging down an entire gallon of water, which, come on, no one can absorb that much at once,
Yeah.
it's more like taking sips over time.
Okay.
The spacing effect is all about giving your brain a chance to soak everything in. At its core, it's spreading out those study sessions instead of cramming everything together at the last minute.
Makes sense.
And this isn't just some random idea. It's backed by solid science and decades of research.
Absolutely. We're talking about a proven strategy here.
Mhm.
And to guide us through this deep dive, we've got a fantastic paper from 1989.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
It's by Frank N. Dempster, published in the Educational Psychology Review, and the title really sets the stage: Spacing Effects and Their Implications for Theory and Practice. It's going to be our roadmap, walking us through a ton of research and revealing how this spacing effect can truly transform how you learn.
Right, we're going for a total learning upgrade.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to understand exactly how the spacing effect works,
Right.
explore where it's most effective and where it might not be, and touch on the main theories behind it. But most importantly, we want to give you actionable insights to start using this in your own life. Whether you're trying to learn a new language, ace an exam, or just remember where you left your keys, we've got you covered.
No more lost keys.
Right.
All right, so to really appreciate how groundbreaking the spacing effect is, we need to take a trip back in time.
Okay. Time travel, I like it. Where are we going?
Back to 1885 to meet Hermann Ebbinghaus. This guy was a pioneer in memory research.
He was the OG of memory research, basically.
He was seriously dedicated, memorizing endless lists of nonsense syllables just to figure out how memory works.
Talk about dedication to science. I can barely remember my grocery list.
And his big discovery was this: spreading out those study sessions was way more effective for remembering those lists than cramming them all in one go.
Okay, that's the seed of the spacing effect right there.
Absolutely foundational. And then a bit later, in the early 1900s, this idea got a little more formal with something called Jost's Law.
Just law. Sounds serious.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Basically, it says if you've got two memories, both equally strong, but one is older, reviewing that older memory will help you remember it even better.
So, like, dusting off those old memories is actually a good thing.
Exactly. It's like giving a little TLC to a well-established tree to keep it strong for years to come. A brand new sapling, though, needs constant attention at first.
So refresh those old memories and watch them thrive.
And after those early discoveries, the research just exploded. Throughout the 20th century, study after study confirmed what Ebbinghaus had seen across all kinds of learning tasks and materials. Researchers like Hintzman, Melton, and Glenberg, their reviews really cemented the spacing effect as a core principle in how we learn and remember.
So it wasn't a fluke, it was the real deal.
It's a rock-solid principle of learning. And the best part, it's not just some tiny improvement. We're talking about a big difference here. Learning with spaced repetitions can be twice as effective as cramming.
Twice as effective? That's huge. Sign me up.
Right. And here's what's even cooler. This effect gets even stronger when you need to remember things long-term.
The long game. That's where it shines.
Exactly. Think about learning a new language.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
You study a bunch of vocabulary words, but then life gets in the way. You don't look at them again for a month. With spacing, when you revisit those words a month later, they're going to stick way better than if you'd crammed them all in one day and never looked at them again.
That's like scientifically proven.
Oh yeah, there's this study from 1987 by Barrick and Phelps. They had people learn and relearn vocabulary over 8 years. 8 years. Imagine the dedication.
These participants were in it for the long haul.
They were the real MVPs of memory research.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was amazing. People who relearned the vocab with 30-day breaks between sessions remembered 2.5 times more words than those who didn't have any breaks.
2.5 times? That's not a little boost. That's a total game changer. So basically, if you're learning a new language, spacing out your review sessions could mean remembering way more vocab years down the line.
That's the power we're talking about.
Okay, I'm convinced. But now, before we get too carried away, we need to be realistic. The spacing effect isn't some magical cure-all.
Right, it's not like it works perfectly in every situation. There are some nuances to consider.
Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. So when might spacing not be the best approach?
One key thing is if you need to remember something immediately.
Okay, so like right this second.
Exactly. In those situations, cramming might actually be just as good or even better than spacing. Think about it. If the information is still fresh in your short-term memory, it doesn't really matter how it got there.
So for those last-minute situations, cramming might still have its place.
There's actually research on this. Back in 1921, a researcher named Austin found that reading a text 5 times in one day was just as effective as reading it once a day for 5 days if the test was immediately after.
Interesting. So cramming can work for immediate recall.
But here's the catch.
Uh-oh, there's always a catch.
When they tested people a few weeks later, the ones who spaced out their readings did way better. So if you need the information for the long term, spacing is the way to go.
Got it. Short-term memory, maybe cramming works. Long-term memory, spacing wins.
That's the takeaway. Now, another factor is the type of material you're trying to learn. Some research on learning those random lists of nonsense syllables, those letter combinations that
Yeah.
don't mean anything.
Like blap and dork.
Exactly. That research has sometimes found that the benefits of spacing are kind of weak, especially when the test is right after studying. It seems like for those kinds of meaningless things, if you need to remember them right away, spacing doesn't really give you a huge advantage.
Okay, so the meaningfulness of the material plays a role. It's not just about the timing.
Exactly. And for certain really basic skills where you just need to be super fast and automatic, like drilling multiplication tables until you know them by heart, massed practice can be more efficient. Thorndike's work from way back in 1916 touched on this idea.
Okay, so for pure speed and automaticity, focused repetition might be the way to go. Now, with all the research on spacing, has it always been smooth sailing? Or have there been some bumps along the way, some findings that didn't quite fit the pattern?
Well, research is never perfectly straightforward, is it? There have been some interesting inconsistencies that popped up over the years, which is normal in science. It helps us refine our understanding. For example, there were some challenges replicating certain findings, like in 1985, Topino and Grayson, they had trouble replicating some early results by Glenberg, which happens sometimes. And there were also some mixed results around paraphrasing. Some studies suggested that if you change the wording when you repeat information, it might wipe out the benefits of spacing, but other studies didn't find that at all. And then there was this one study where just changing the speaker's voice during the repetitions seemed to get rid of the spacing effect, which was kind of weird and not always replicated.
So it's not always a simple, straightforward effect. The way you present the information and the context can play subtle roles.
Right, there are layers to this. And speaking of layers, what about age? Does spacing work the same way for kids as it does for adults?
That's a really good question. Our brains change so much as we age. It makes sense that learning strategies might need to adapt too.
Well, there was this early study in 1984 by Topino and DeGeorge, and they actually found no spacing effect in preschoolers, which was a bit of a head-scratcher, especially because other research had suggested it might even be present in infants. However, a later study in 1987 by Rea and Modigliani, they found the spacing effect across all ages they tested, including preschoolers. So maybe that earlier finding was a bit of an anomaly.
Okay, so it seems like the spacing effect is pretty consistent across different ages, which
Yeah.
suggests it's a pretty fundamental way our brains work.
That's what it looks like.
Now, one thing I'm really curious about is the timing between study sessions. Is there, like, a magic number, the perfect amount of time to wait before you revisit the material?
Oh, I wish there was a simple answer to that. But unfortunately, the ideal spacing interval isn't always the same. It can depend on what you're learning, how complex it is, and how long you need to remember it. Some research has suggested that after a certain point, making the breaks even longer doesn't always lead to much more learning. But then you've got other studies, like that long-term vocabulary study we talked about, where longer intervals really paid off.
Okay, so it's kind of a balancing act.
Hmm.
But the overall message is clear. Spreading things out is generally better than cramming. Now, let's broaden our scope a bit. We've mainly talked about vocabulary and texts, but the spacing effect isn't limited to just those things, right? It's got wider applications.
Absolutely. That's the really cool part. It's versatility. We see spacing effects in all sorts of verbal learning tasks. Think about trying to remember pairs of words, recalling a list of items in order, or even recognizing something you've seen before. It's a general principle that pops up all over the place.
So whether I'm trying to remember names, facts, or even just where I put my phone, spacing can help.
Pretty much.
And what about different types of materials? Is it just about words and text?
Nope, not at all. We're talking about everything from those abstract nonsense syllables to everyday words, sentences, pictures, even faces. The evidence is there. Spacing out your exposure to all kinds of information helps you remember it better.
That's amazing. So like if I'm trying to remember a new coworker's name, spacing could help.
Totally. And if you're trying to remember the details of a painting you saw in a museum, same thing. Space it out.
Now I'm curious about real-world applications. Have researchers taken this out of the lab and into classrooms?
Oh, yeah, they definitely have. Early researchers were really keen on figuring out how to use spacing to improve education. For instance, there was this study in 1913 by Pyle where he looked at kids learning addition facts. The kids who practiced once a day for 10 days actually remembered the facts better than the kids who practiced twice a day for 5 days. A clear win for spacing.
Okay, so it's not just a theory. It works in real-world situations.
It's not just a lab phenomenon.
And it goes beyond basic facts too, right? What about understanding concepts in subjects like science or math?
Absolutely, it applies there too. There's research showing that spacing helps with learning science terms, mathematical rules, all that good stuff.
So if I'm struggling with a particularly tricky concept, I should space out my study sessions rather than trying to cram it all at once.
It's a much better strategy. Now, we talked about vocabulary earlier, but are there any other specific findings related to language learning?
Language learning is something so many people struggle with.
Oh, yeah, and the spacing effect can be a huge help. Dempster's research in 1987 found that when students were presented with uncommon English words and their definitions, they learned them way better when the presentations were spaced out compared to when they were all bunched together. Some experiments even showed that recall was 50 to 100% higher with spaced learning.
That's a massive difference. I wish I knew about this when I was trying to learn Spanish.
It's definitely a game changer. And what about when you're dealing with larger amounts of information, like reading a textbook chapter or reviewing lecture notes?
Yeah, those could be tough to get through and even tougher to remember.
Well, the good news is spacing helps there too. Studies have shown that reading a text twice with a decent gap in between, whether it's 48 hours or even just 30 minutes, leads to better comprehension and retention than just reading it all in one go. And there's research on spaced out readings of textbook sections and even memory for specific paragraphs, all showing benefits from spacing.
So no matter what you're learning, spacing is a powerful tool.
It's a pretty universal principle.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about testing. Often we think of tests as just a way to measure what we know, right? Like a scorecard for our knowledge.
Yeah, like a judgment day.
But it turns out testing can actually be a really effective way to learn and remember things better.
Oh, absolutely. This is something people often overlook. Way back in 1968, researchers Lackman and Laffery pointed out that tests aren't just about assessment, they can actually shape what we remember. And the research has backed that up. Simply taking a test on material, even if you don't get any feedback, improves how well you remember it later.
So it's not about the grade, it's about the act of retrieving the information.
The effort is key. There was this fascinating study all the way back in the 1920s by Jones. He found that students who were tested on material remembered twice as much as those who weren't tested.
Twice as much. That's pretty remarkable. So it's not just about passively reading or listening. It's about actively trying to recall the information from memory.
The act of retrieval is a big memory booster.
And that brings us to the idea of the test spacing effect, right? Spacing out the tests themselves.
Exactly, that's the next level. Just like spacing out study sessions helps, spacing out those tests is even more beneficial than bunching them together, especially if you gradually increase the time between those tests.
So it's like each time you retrieve the information, it becomes a little stronger and more deeply ingrained in your memory.
You're building those neural pathways, making them more robust. Landauer and Bjork in 1978 did this really interesting study on learning names. They found that using increasing intervals between tests led to much better long-term retention of those names.
Okay, so it's not just about testing more often, it's about testing smarter.
Strategic testing.
Got it. Can you give me another example of how this works in practice?
Sure. Rea and Modigliani in 1985 looked at kids learning multiplication facts and spelling lists. They compared what happened when they tested kids rapidly versus when they spread out the tests with increasing intervals. For the multiplication facts, the kids who had the spaced-out tests showed almost twice the retention compared to the other group.
Wow, almost twice as much. That's a huge difference. So testing itself is a powerful learning tool, and spacing out those tests with longer and longer intervals seems to be the most effective way to use testing to really boost learning. Are there any other things that influence how effective testing is?
Yeah, a few things to keep in mind. First, timing is key. It seems like the best time to do that first test after you've learned something new is pretty soon after, while it's still somewhat fresh in your mind, but not so soon that you're just pulling it from short-term memory.
Right. You don't want it to be too easy. You want to challenge yourself a bit.
Exactly. And then it's super important to actually get the answer right during those practice tests. If you try to remember something and just can't, you're less likely to remember it later compared to things you successfully retrieved.
So active engagement is key. Really wrestling with the material and getting those answers right.
Exactly. And it also seems like tests have a bigger impact on questions that are repeated across multiple tests compared to brand new questions. But even those new questions can be beneficial because they force you to think about the material in new ways, which can be really helpful.
Okay, so testing isn't just about reinforcing specific facts. It's about building a deeper understanding of the material as a whole. This is all really fascinating. Now, let's get into the why behind all of this. What are the leading theories that attempt to explain why the spacing effect and this test spacing effect are so powerful?
This is where it gets really interesting. There's a whole history of researchers trying to figure out the mechanisms behind these effects. Back in 1974, Hintzman, he did a great job of categorizing these theories. Basically, there are two main camps.
Okay, lay 'em on me.
First, you've got encoding variability theories.
Encoding variability. Okay.
And then you've got what are called deficient processing theories. So two main approaches to understanding what's going on in the brain.
All right, let's break those down, starting with encoding variability.
So with encoding variability, the basic idea is that when you space out those repetitions, you're encountering the information in slightly different contexts each time. Think about it. Your mood might be different. What you had for lunch might be different. The room you're in might be different. All those things can subtly influence how your brain encodes the information, creating more retrieval paths.
So it's like creating multiple backups of the information in your brain.
Exactly. It's like having different routes to get to your friend's house.
I like that analogy.
If you only know one way and that road is closed, you're stuck. But if you know multiple ways to get there, you're good to go. Encoding variability is all about having multiple pathways to access the memory.
Makes sense. But you mentioned that this theory has been challenged.
Yeah, so while this idea sounds good on paper, the research hasn't always been fully supportive. There have been cases where actually trying to manipulate the context didn't really lead to better recall, and sometimes it even made it worse. And there are some other findings that don't quite fit.
So it might play a role, but it's probably not the whole story.
Right, there's more to the puzzle.
Okay, now let's talk about deficient processing theories. What's the gist there?
So these theories suggest that when you repeat information too soon, your brain doesn't process it as deeply as when you space those repetitions out. The idea is that the amount of effort you put into processing something really affects how well you remember it.
So spacing forces you to engage more deeply with the material, leading to stronger memories.
Exactly. And within this category, you've got a few different specific hypotheses, each with its own nuances. You've got consolidation, habituation, rehearsal, and voluntary attention.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Let's break those down one by one, starting with consolidation.
So the consolidation hypothesis put forth by Landauer says that when you learn something new, it's initially fragile in your memory. Over time, your brain needs to kind of solidify that information, make it more permanent, and if you try to repeat it too soon, before this process is complete, you might actually mess it up.
So it's like interrupting the drying process of concrete.
Exactly. You need to give it time to set. The problem is there hasn't been a ton of direct evidence for this specific mechanism being the main driver of the spacing effect. And the time frames for consolidation don't always match up with the spacing intervals that work best.
Okay, so it's an interesting idea, but maybe not the complete answer.
Right. Now, habituation, this one's pretty simple. Our brains tend to get used to things that happen over and over again. Like if you hear a loud noise repeatedly, you'll start to tune it out. The habituation hypothesis suggests that the same thing happens with massed repetitions. Your brain just starts to ignore them after a while.
So it's like your brain gets bored with the repetition.
Exactly. But the issue is that for this theory to work, this habituation effect would have to be super short-lived to explain why spacing with different intervals all seems to help. So, not a perfect fit.
Got it. Now, what about rehearsal? Does spacing give you more time to mentally rehearse the information?
That's the idea behind the rehearsal hypothesis. The more time between study sessions, the more opportunities you have to think about the information and go over it in your mind. And we know that rehearsal strengthens memory, so it makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
Practice makes perfect.
The problem is, some studies that tried to control rehearsal didn't find the expected effects. And here's the clincher, we see spacing effects even in really young kids who don't rehearse as much. So, again, not the whole story.
Okay, that makes sense. Young kids' brains benefit from spacing, even without sophisticated rehearsal strategies. So, what about voluntary attention? Does that play a role?
This one's interesting. The voluntary attention hypothesis basically says that we choose to pay less attention when repetitions are close together. Like when we see something again right away, we think we've got it and kind of zone out.
Oh, I totally do that. I'm like, yeah, I know that already, and then I completely forget it later.
Exactly. And there is some evidence for this. Studies have shown that people remember things better when the preceding items were also masked, suggesting a brief mental break in attention. And Dempster's research using questionnaires found that students said they paid more attention during spaced readings. There's even some evidence from studies that looked at pupil dilation, suggesting more attention with longer spacing
So
intervals.
it's like our brains are wired to pay more attention to things that are novel or unexpected.
That's the idea. But there are some problems with this theory, too. When researchers tried to force people to pay more attention during massed repetitions, it didn't always erase the spacing effect. And we also see spacing effects in situations where people aren't consciously trying to learn, like incidental learning, and in young kids who don't have as much control over their attention. Plus, the spacing effect is so widespread, it's hard to believe it's all about conscious attention.
So it might be part of the explanation, but not the whole story.
Right. So, what's the current thinking? What theory is winning the spacing effect race?
Give me the front runner.
Well, the leading contender right now is called the accessibility reconstruction hypothesis, and it makes a lot of sense. The basic idea is that when you repeat information, your brain tries to pull up the memory of the last time you encountered it. If the repetitions are close together, that memory is easy to access, so your brain doesn't have to work very hard. But if the repetitions are spaced out, that memory is a bit harder to find, so your brain has to put in more effort to retrieve and rebuild it. And this extra effort strengthens the memory, making it stick better.
Like if you have to work harder for something, you appreciate it more.
Exactly. Your brain is like, wow, I had to really dig for that information. I better hold on to it tight. Delarosa, Bourne, Dempster, Jacobi, Rose, Rea, and Modigliani, a lot of researchers have championed this idea.
So it's all about challenging your brain and making it work for those memories. Sounds like a good workout for the mind. But has this hypothesis been fully confirmed?
Well, it lines up nicely with a lot of the findings, but it's not completely slam dunk. Some studies that looked at how accessible memories are didn't find exactly what they expected. But this hypothesis does a really good job of explaining why both spaced presentations and space tests are so good for memory. Taking a test, especially after a while, forces you to really search for that memory, and that active retrieval strengthens it.
It's like weightlifting for your memory.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier that reviewing information and testing yourself might have slightly different effects on memory.
Yeah, some researchers believe that reviewing is more about solidifying the initial memory trace.
Kind of like reinforcing the foundation.
Exactly. While testing is more about strengthening your ability to access that memory.
So reviewing is like organizing your files, and
Yeah.
testing is like practicing finding the right file quickly.
A good analogy. This fits with the idea that active retrieval is key for building strong, lasting memories.
Okay, this has been super insightful. We've learned a lot about why spacing works so well, but let's get practical here. What does all of this mean for how we learn, both individually and in education?
This is where the rubber meets the road, right? You'd think with all this research, spacing and space testing would be everywhere.
Like the golden rule of learning.
But it's not that simple. The reality is there's a big gap between the research and how things are done in the real world.
So we know it works, but we're not using it.
That's the frustrating part. Even a lot of psychologists who study learning aren't fully aware of how much research there is, especially from earlier years. And this knowledge hasn't really trickled down to teachers and those who design curriculums.
That's a huge missed opportunity.
It really is. Dempster, back in 1989, he pointed out that a lot of textbooks for teachers barely even mention the spacing effect. And space testing, forget about it. Tests are still mainly seen as a way to grade, not to help students learn better.
So why do you think there's this disconnect? Why aren't we using these powerful techniques more?
A few reasons, I think. First, it's counterintuitive. When you cram, it feels like you're making progress because you can remember things right away. Spacing feels less productive in the moment. Even educators sometimes fall into this trap, thinking that massed repetition is better.
We're drawn to that immediate sense of accomplishment.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of review. Consistent review is crucial for spacing to work its magic. But in many classrooms, it's not a regular practice. Teachers don't always revisit old material, and even textbooks often don't do a great job with spaced review.
So we're not setting students up for success with spacing.
Unfortunately not. And then, of course, there's the underuse of testing as a learning tool.
Right, we're stuck in this mindset of tests as punishment or evaluation.
Yeah, we need to shift that. A lot of education systems rely on infrequent, high-stakes tests instead of weaving in regular, low-stakes quizzes and tests to help students really learn.
So if we did embrace spaced review and testing, what kind of impact could we have? Beyond just better grades, what else could we expect?
I think we could see some really positive changes. Research suggests that spaced presentations are actually more engaging than massed repetitions, which could mean students pay more attention in class.
So happier, more engaged students.
Exactly. And students might find spaced practice more enjoyable too, less boring than cramming.
Who doesn't hate cramming?
Seriously. And one study even found that sixth graders actually thought spaced review questions were both useful and interesting. Imagine that.
So not only do they learn better, they actually enjoy it more. That's a win-win. Okay, so how can we actually put this into practice? What are some concrete steps teachers and even individuals can take to start using spaced review and testing?
There are a lot of easy things to try. Teachers can ask questions about older topics during class, assign homework that revisits key concepts, encourage students to write summaries of past lessons, and give quizzes that cover material from earlier units.
So building in those regular check-ins.
Exactly. And for individuals, think about flashcard apps. They often use spaced repetition algorithms to schedule your reviews. And you can always just space out your study sessions and quiz yourself regularly.
Simple but effective. And it's not just about spacing, it's about how you space, right?
Right. Ideally, those intervals should increase over time. You test yourself relatively soon after learning something, and then you gradually increase the time between those tests, that foreign language vocabulary program we talked about. That's a great example of how to do it.
So challenge yourself a little more each time.
Exactly.
This has been an incredible deep dive into the science of learning and memory. The main takeaway for you, our listener, is this. By spacing out your learning and testing yourself at increasing intervals, you can seriously boost your ability to remember and understand things. It's backed by science and can change how you learn.
We encourage you to think about how you can apply this to your own life. Whatever you're trying to learn, whether it's for work, school, or just for fun, consider how you can space out your study sessions and incorporate testing. Even small changes can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to ponder. If spacing and space testing are so effective, why aren't they more widely used in education and in our personal lives? What are the obstacles, and how can we overcome them to unlock more effective learning for everyone?
That's the challenge ahead of us. We've given you a solid understanding of these powerful techniques, but the journey doesn't end here. We encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of learning and memory.
There's always more to learn.
Keep those brains engaged.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.